Hello, this is Amy from Good Food Unearthed, and I'm going to be sharing with you part two of my presentation, a brief overview on human rights. Part two is going to be looking specifically at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and constitutional law here in Canada, with specific attention to the declarations of emergency and the COVID-19 measures, such as the lockdowns, the mask mandates, the business closures, the cancellations of surgeries, and so on. So, we're not going to go into too much detail, but this is just to get you started again so you can know your rights and know how to effectively defend them. All right. So, in our first part, we looked at human rights, what they were, why we have them, and if there's ever a justification to violate those rights. Well, here in Canada, it is stated that constitutional law is the supreme law in Canada, and that if any laws are made that violate the Constitution, they are in fact null and void. So it'd be interesting to see when we look at later on the public health and promotion acts that are in each province that have allowed for medical martial law to take place and suspend human rights. How far that's going to go, we have yet to see, but it's up to each one of us to know our rights and to stand up for them because nobody else can do it for us. So let's look at this Constitution Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The very first section is what I want to focus on. And we're going to start with the first statement in the Charter, which makes it the most important. And it says that whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Now, in the previous interview, we talked about natural law, and we talked about how all of the world religions and cultures recognize natural law in such things as the golden rule, or karma, or the maxim of reciprocity. So, this constitution is not superior to natural law, but it recognizes the supremacy of that. And the statement here is God, or you could say the divine, or all that is, or the creator, the creation, whatever name you want to use, that gives expression to all of this existence. That's supreme, that's above the Constitution Act. And on top of that, or together with that, actually, is the rule of law. And we're going to look at these two, the supremacy of God and the rule of law, to break down what they mean. But just know that the Constitution is below this. And then the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada as a functioning society. So, ideally, if it is a free society, then all people, all participants are in mutual agreement of the laws that are enacted, of the Constitution. Any laws that violate the Constitution should be null and void. And as Canada is a signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, if anything's in violation of the human rights, those should be null and void. If anything exists that contravenes human rights, then we are not existing in a society that is free, just, and peaceful by definition. So, the second part of this states in Section 1 that the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Now, that section, I'm going to delve into because that is being held up now as the reason for the infringements upon our human rights here in Canada due to COVID 19. And I will show you how this is not, cannot be used as an excuse, the section 1. And then we're going to look at the fundamental freedoms. So these fundamental freedoms, which should not be violated, are the freedom of conscience and religion, the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. And for each one of those, we're going to break down the terms to see what we're talking about. So let's start off with that first statement in recognition of the supremacy of God. These are the laws of existence, the natural laws that exist whether or not we have human made laws. These are the laws that are always there. And I think it's stated best in this quote from the Tao. If you want to be a great leader, you must learn to follow the Tao. Stop trying to control. Let go of fixed plans and concepts, and the world will govern itself. The more prohibitions you have, the less virtuous people will be. The more weapons you have, the less secure people will be. The more subsidies you have, the less self-reliant people will be. Therefore, the Master says, I let go of the law, and people become honest. I let go of economics, and people become prosperous. I let go of religion, and people become serene. I let go of desire for the common good, and the good becomes common as grass. Now, I understand that for some people, this sounds like wishy-washy nonsense, but you have to understand and experience how the nature of reality works to see that this is true. And I welcome anybody to try and see whether you're a parent or a sibling or you're simply coexisting with another living being. Try controlling that other living being and see the effects of that. You'll see the feedback. Or instead, try to have a mutual, valued, respectful relationship with that human being, which requires you to drop thoughts of superiority or inferiority or one-upping the other or making it your way or the highway, and choose instead to mutually beneficially coexist. If you're a gardener, you can see how this works. If you force your growth with fertilizers and you try to control pests with pesticides, ultimately you destroy your soil, you destroy the health of your crops, and you don't get the nutrients that you need from your food. But you can learn to listen to nature. You can learn by observing to see how the seeds take root and what works best for them. And you can help to assist in not doing a lot, but just helping to have that nurturing environment that doesn't require fertilizer, it doesn't require pesticides, it requires minimal maintenance to allow it to do its thing. And in that way, everyone is nurtured in growth and evolution. So the next part of that first phrase is the rule of law. So, what this basically states is that every single person is subject to the law, including people who are lawmakers, law enforcement officials, and judges. And I know people will talk about, well, the phrasing of person and legalese means such and such. Okay, but this again is in the statement that is above any laws stated after it, right? Constitutional law, the supremacy of God, and the rule of law. The concept is that with the rule being written, every person, every human being is subject to the law. Now, is this in reply to the laws of nature? Since it's in that first statement, I would interpret it as such, but I'm sure there could be other interpretations. But what this does imply is that we're all on equal footing, and you cannot have some with more rights than others. You cannot have some who avoid, who are exempt from facing consequences for violating the law, and others who are not exempt. All right, so let's look at the fundamental freedoms that were mentioned. And this is from the Government of Canada's website. Under Section 2 of the Charter, Canadians are free to follow the religion of their choice. In addition, they are guaranteed freedom of thought, belief, and expression. Since the media are an important means for communicating thoughts and ideas, the Charter protects the right of the press and other media to speak out. Our right to gather and act in peaceful groups is also protected, as is our right to belong to an association. These freedoms are set out in the Charter to ensure that Canadians are free to create and express their ideas, gather to discuss them, and communicate them widely to other people. Look at that language there. Pay close attention. Ask yourself if this is being respected and protected today. These activities are basic forms of individual liberty. They are also important to the success of a democratic society like Canada. In a democracy, people must be free to discuss matters of public policy, criticize governments, and offer their own solutions to social problems. Now, yes, I know democracy is a problematic term, but you need to take it in the context of this statement here and gain what you can from it. Now, you can come up with your definition, and if you have a conversation with somebody, if you're trying to prove your point, make sure you define what you mean by a democracy and let it go from there. We can get hung up on the weeds, on nitpicking here and there, or you can take the approach of asking yourself, what is this paragraph saying and how can I use it to my benefit? And then the answers will come to you to help you. Or you can set yourself obstacles and say, well, this isn't going to help me, and that's not going to help me, and this is going to be a downfall, and this is going to be an obstacle. And then that's all you're going to see. So, what we're looking at here is that people must be free to discuss matters of public policy. They must be free to criticize governments, and they must be free to offer their own solutions to social problems. You, as an individual, you have the freedoms to do that, or you should in a free society. Again, remember, if we do not have respect and observance for the inherent, inalienable freedom, dignity, and rights of all of humanity without distinction, then we are not in a free, just, and peaceful society because it is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. So let's look at that first fundamental freedom, the freedom of conscience and religion. Now, we talked about freedom and conscience in part one, but we'll go into it again here. And freedom is to not be controlled by the obligations and will of another. Remember, again, that this is inherent, it cannot be removed from you. You may have limited choices, but you always have free will. The free will never goes away, no matter how much force is applied, no matter what coercion. Free will is always there. Conscience, again, is take it apart as con and science with science. So, this is you, the individual. You are a perceiver of experience in your existence right now in this moment. Science is your daily act. This is what you do all the time. You observe, you gather information, it coalesces in your mind, you form theories, you experiment, which is your actions or your speech that you decide to take. And then from that, you get feedback. And from that, that's more information that coalesces and then forms new theories. And then you act again, and so on. So, with that, you come to ideas, to concepts through your reasoning, which is taking all of that information and inferring. And you infer ideas about your ethics, about what you consider to be beneficial and harmful, right or wrong. That is your conscience. Now, religion, when you look at the root of the word religare, from the Latin, it means to bind, to bound. Religion is the practice of one's beliefs or worldviews. And again, belief is accepting a statement as true. And this comes from your conscience and reasoning. So they're interconnected here. All of these concepts are interconnected. Your religion is your actions and your speech being bound by your beliefs, your worldview about how things exist and why. And that comes from your conscience and reasoning. And you have that freedom. This is inherent, it cannot be taken from you. And when another tries to repress this, tries to say, no, you can't do that, then that person who tries to repress that has no respect and value for you, for your dignity as a human being existing just as you are. Freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Now let's just go back one more because I want to touch on something here, and it's something I touched on in part one. Religion. Now there's a lot of people who have adopted scientism, and this is an ideology, and it does not have to be based on facts. It is based on a belief in experts, people who hold certain titles, who have certain credentials behind their name. There's no questioning. You have to listen to the experts. They know what's best, they're trained, and you follow them. And this is like how people would follow the priest. in a religion and you couldn't question them because they were your medium between God. They could connect and you could not. You had to connect to God through the priest. The scientist knows the nature of realities and you cannot. You are incapable. That is the belief. And so you trust the science. You follow the scientists. You listen to the experts. Now, this is not fact-based, and it's a religion. It's a choice that develops from somebody's beliefs, from somebody's worldviews. And what is happening right now is many people are being forced to conform with scientism, not science, scientism. And that is a violation of your freedom of religion as well as your freedom of conscience. And your freedom of conscience and religion, again, since the religion is the practicing of your beliefs that are tied in with your conscience and your reasoning, the way that you approach your health care is intimately tied into this. Intimately tied in. Your health care stems from your conscience, from your practice of your beliefs, your worldview. And the question that people need to ask themselves is if they believe that an expert has the right to take away your bodily autonomy. Now, if you personally believe that, that is your choice, that is your freedom of conscience and religion. But you cannot force that on someone else. You can state that, and we'll get into that with the next one. You can state that, but you cannot force that on someone else. And if you do, we do not live in a free, just, and peaceful society. We live in a dictatorship. So, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression. What is thought? The ability to form concepts based on your perceptions. This is based on the information that you take in through your experience. And you develop concepts. And those concepts can develop into beliefs, accepting certain things as true because you've put these certain pieces together. And then you have opinion. So that is your statement of that view or the perception based on your information received. Again, these are all intimately connected. So you can have a thought. You can have thoughts about the science, and you can freely express them in a free, just, and peaceful society. You can have thoughts about politics, and you should be able to freely express them, again, if the society is free, just, and peaceful, if they inherently respect and value human rights. You can have belief that is your worldview, you're accepting of a certain thing as true, and that's based on your perception. And again, this is something that is already intimately a part of you. Now, what becomes your right is your right to express that, your right to say it, and your right to act on that, which is your religion, your practice of your beliefs, your practice, your actions that are bound by your worldview. And if you are not free to choose your words, to choose your actions, then you have to ask, is it a free, just, and peaceful society? And again, we'll go back to when people say, well, what if It infringes on the freedoms of others. Well, go back to part one when we talked about how to truly be free. It is not merely enough to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that enhances and promotes the freedom of others. Otherwise, you're not free. An oppressor is somebody who is not free themselves. So we have right now this censorship. We have this punishment for speaking one's thoughts, beliefs, and opinions, for choosing to protest, for choosing not to follow medical mandates. When you have, when you take an action, when you intend to incite panic or incite acts of violence or discrimination, or you use your speech to defame or libel or slander, there's already in law repercussions for this. There's already recourse. There doesn't need to be controlling of the information. I read a wonderful quote today that somebody shared that Thomas Jefferson wrote about freedom of speech, and I think he was also quoting Benjamin Franklin. And this statement kind of sums it up, but the truth is not fragile. It does not need to be protected. Let people speak. Let everyone speak. The truth is always there, and it will reveal itself because a lie cannot survive. It can be perpetuated, but it cannot survive. It cannot withhold the scrutiny. So allow the scrutiny to be there. Allow the conversation to happen. That is what a free and just and peaceful society will support. The ultimate flaw of censoring misinformation, and again, censorship of free speech is paradoxical because the ends cannot justify the means. But the ultimate flaw is who decides what is valuable information and what is not. Who gets to decide what information another is exposed to? This assumes that another is too unintelligent to discern for oneself what information can help one to grow and evolve. This is based again on an assumption of superiority and inferiority. There is no need to censor in a free society. The truth is not fragile. And on top of that, people will have their own thoughts, their own beliefs, and their own opinions, regardless of how much it is attempted to be controlled on the superficial level. I don't know if anybody has seen 1984 or read the book from George Orwell, or if you know of anybody who lived during oppressive regimes recently or from the past. But just because outwardly thought, belief, and opinion, the expression of those is repressed, does not mean that the differences of thought, belief, and opinion have gone away. Now, if somebody has racist thoughts, opinions, and beliefs, personally, I would rather them say it so that I know where they stand than them try to hide it and be covert and say what they think I want them to say, and then I don't know where they stand. Where are we when we demand people to speak as we speak? Are we really opening up to understanding and growing together in peaceful coexistence. So let's look now at freedom of peaceful assembly. So, peaceful is basically non-violent. There's no force employed. An assembly is the gathering together of individuals. This comes from your free will to choose to come together with another. And it could be for one specific purpose or just to come together the way that people do in a park for various reasons, but they're all together. And that's your freedom. That's how humans move and interact. And you are you are not given that. This is inalienable. Your freedom of peaceful assembly. When this is trying to be repressed with the social distancing and the isolation and the quarantine and the closure of borders and restrictions on travel, and the isolation, especially of the elderly, and the children not being able to go visit their friends or not to be able to interact in a way that they so choose. When that happens, that does not take away a person's desire to assemble. In fact, we know in science and in public health and medicine that social interaction, face to face, human touch, human connection, not online, not via a screen, but actual presence and actually physically having contact is a human need. A need. And that is being violated. Is there justification for that? I will ask you to go, and if you so choose, to be sovereign, to be in control of yourself, to be free, then you will take personal accountability to look into that evidence exhaustively. And again, if you choose that that is something you want to do, that's your personal choice, but you cannot force that on somebody else. Otherwise, you do not respect human rights. Freedom of association is essentially the free will to choose to interact with another. It is not that you have to join a group and this group or that group, and you can't be forced to join this group or that group. That's part of it. But association is basically the act of connecting with another, the act of interacting with another. And you can choose to have a conversation with somebody who you don't like and whose actions you don't condone. But there's nothing wrong with you choosing to say hello to that person or to choose to sit down and have a conversation with them for whatever your reasons are. We have the phrase of we should not make people guilty by association. Well, that's being that's being breached massively. We're trying to make connections here and there with cancel culture, which I won't go into too much. But with the COVID-19 and the conspiracy theory and the censorship, the guilty by association is being used often as a justification for acts of censorship, for acts of penalizing certain individuals, to show as an example of you must comply or you'll be like this person. You must comply or you will get what they got. So we should be free to associate. And when we're trying to implement this segregated society with the vaccination immunity passes and the biometric IDs and the no mask, no service, we are wedging, we are dividing into an apartheid state. And you have to ask yourself, where does this end? Are you going to force every single person to get vaccinated and wear a mask? And then will it be okay? And what about the people who are conscientious objectors? What will you do with them? Think it through. Think about what kind of society you want Canada to be. So let's talk about when and how the government can put limits on your rights. And this is the section 1 in the Charter. It states that limits on rights and freedoms can occur if that limit is A, set out in a law, B, pursues an important goal which can be justified in a free and democratic society, and 3, pursues that goal in a reasonable and proportionate manner. Now, first of all, a free, just, and peaceful society, by definition, is founded on respect and observance, respect and protection of the inherent dignity and inalienable rights and freedoms of all of humanity without distinction. Period. Any laws that go against that would not stand up, should not stand up, and if they do, you are not living in a free, just, and peaceful society. Now, the goal that is stated has to be important. We're going to look at that. And then to pursue that goal, it has to be done in a reasonable and proportionate manner. So we're going to look at that. Now, if the government limits your rights without good reason, there are 3 types of remedies provided. First, you can ask the court for any remedy that is appropriate and just in the circumstances. Now, some things you can do are file human rights complaints and you can get an investigation and compensation. You can also file civil court claims. So that would be like small claims court. And you can get compensation for that. So it would not be in a criminal court, but a civil law. And that's also often called common law. Now, common law is also called case law. There's some definitions to get into. What I would recommend if you're new to studying law is to search types of law, and you'll see the various different types and you can look into each one. So second, a remedy is available when authorities carrying out investigations for the government, for example, police officers, violated a person's charter rights. So the COVID-19 measures, and we'll go into why, but they are all in violation of your charter rights with no justification. Therefore, anybody enforcing them is violating your charter rights and they can be held personally liable. And one of the most powerful things you can do is to give notices of liability to individuals who have violated them. Make them know that they can be held individually liable for what they are doing, for violating your charter rights and freedoms. There's no justification. They would not be able to support themselves with evidence, and you can. Third, if the court finds that a law or a section of a law violates a person's charter rights, they can make an order saying that the law is not valid. And I would say that if you look at your province's Health Promotion and Protection Act, whatever it's called, you'll look it up and see that that is in violation of your charter rights. and you can challenge that. Now, I may not be absolutely correct on that. You may find better information, but go ahead and have a look. Because my impression is that those health promotion and protection acts are in violation of human rights. They allow for medical martial law at the discretion of one individual who then is above the rule of law. They cannot be held liable for any actions taken through that statute. And that statute suppresses patient rights, consent rights, human rights, disability rights, property rights. There's a host. So go ahead and investigate that. Now, human rights, they're protected in other statutes, not just the Charter. But you have the Canadian Bill of Rights that guarantees many basic rights and freedoms, and the Canadian Human Rights Act, which was passed in 1977, and each province also has a Human Rights Act or a Human Rights Code. And this prohibits discrimination in the context of employment and, make note of this, and the provision of goods, services, facilities, or accommodations generally available to the public. It prevents discriminatory practices based on a number of grounds, including race, national or ethnic origin, sex, and disability. Now, it's not just that, it's any distinction. Any distinction. The Act applies to the Government of Canada, First Nations governments, and federally regulated private businesses, including banking, airline, telecommunications and broadcasting, and interprovincial transportation sectors. If you are a licensed practicing private business, you are licensed through the government, provincially and federally, to practice where you are, which means you are subject to the Canadian Human Rights Act and to your province's Human Rights Act or code. So let's look at this reasonable limits. Now, what we're going to talk about is what are the things that need to be met. So in general, we'll look at under analysis in general, and this comes from the government website. The onus of proof under Section 1, this is for demonstrable justification, is on the person seeking to justify the limit, which is generally the government. So the onus of proof on justifying the limits on your rights and freedoms needs to come from the government, needs to be demonstrably justified. The standard of proof is the civil standard or balance of probabilities. In order to be capable of justification under Section 1, the limit on the right or freedom must be prescribed by law. In order to be prescribed by law, a limit must not be vague, and that's important to remember. So the Oakes test. A limit on a charter right must be reasonable and demonstrably justified. So 1, is the legislative goal pressing and substantial? So this comes with looking at the declarations of emergency and the facts around the case, not the hype, not the propaganda, the facts. And is the goal pressing and substantial? Well, if you looked at the facts at the time, no. Now, could there have been a limited targeted action taken if people were concerned and afraid? Yes. And this is where number 2 comes in. Is there proportionality between the objective and the means used to achieve it? but we did not have proportionality, and we did not have specific, precise, targeted approaches that were strict in their limitations. So the second branch of the test has three elements: rational connection, which is the limit must be rationally connected to the objective. Rationally connected. If you're talking about a new virus, now let's just say you accept the virus theory, the germ theory, and there's a virus going around and it's a respiratory virus and it has a high infectivity rate. Everything that scientists know about that is that you can't eliminate the spread. You can't. You can't stop the spread. So you don't have a rational connection for social distancing, for mask wearing, for isolation, for remaining indoors at home, for quarantining, and especially quarantining and isolating the healthy or asymptomatic. All of the science shows that none of that would be effective if you had a viral pathogen that was a respiratory virus with a high infectivity rate and a low infection fatality rate on top of that. So this states as the second part of this, it must not be arbitrary, unfair, or based on irrational considerations. Okay, we have arbitrary rules, which again, they don't make sense. They're broad, they're illogical, and they're irrational. And they're coming from irrational considerations, not based on demonstrably, they're not based on justifications that are proven by evidence. Part B, minimal impairment. The limit must impair the right or freedom no more than is reasonably necessary to accomplish the objective. The government will be required to show that there are no less rights impairing means of achieving the objective in a reasonable and substantial manner. Now, this has not been met. Minimal impairment, and they have to show that there was no other way to do it in a more effective manner to reach that objective. And what was the objective? The objective, the goalposts have changed, but have they changed based on facts and evidence? No. C, final balancing. This states that whether there is proportionality between the effects of the measure that limits the right and the law's objective. Now, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has released a document specifically here in Canada that has all the data from the government websites that's been collected since the start of the lockdowns in March. And it shows that the lockdown measures have proven more harmful than the statistics of the harms of COVID-19. And we know as well that those numbers have been intentionally jacked up for COVID-19. So even with the misreporting, even with the numbers jacked up here in Canada, what we have found is that harms, the deaths that have resulted from the lockdown measures compared to the deaths of COVID-19 is 12-1. Now, where is the balance in that? So 4 talks about the pressing and substantial objective. So your objective at the start was to flatten the curve, to make sure the hospitals were not overwhelmed. And they weren't, and there's evidence of that. But then the objective shifted. So we have this measure where there was a declared emergency, and there in fact was no emergency here in Canada. So was it a pressing and substantial objective? No, not based on any evidence. The proportionality, again, it had to be rationally connected to the objective. It had to impair the right or freedom as little as possible. And the final stage of the Oakes test, that final balancing, is basically looking at whether that infringement on your rights proved to be of greater benefit than any harms produced by it. Now, the first three stages of Oakes are anchored in an assessment of the law's purpose. Only the fourth branch takes full account of the severity of the deleterious effects of a measure on individuals or groups. The final part of this, the evidence under Section 1, goes on to state that the onus of proving a Section 1 justification rests with the government, and the government should be prepared to adduce appropriate evidence. It should therefore engage in careful planning and record keeping, given that the purpose of the limit must be the purpose at the time at which it is implemented. The groundwork for a Section 1 justification should be laid during the process of policy development. While the purpose should usually be obvious from the text of the legislation itself, it is often useful to have supporting evidence as well. And the description goes on, and again, you can get this from the Canadian government's website. So one thing I'm going to show you after this is some resources you can look at to get more information on why these COVID measures are all violations of your charter rights, why the declaration of emergency was never demonstrably justified. There's no evidence to back it up, and how even now there is a greater amount of evidence to say that what is happening, the COVID measures, the lockdowns, the isolation, the quarantine, the cancellation of surgeries, the masking of children, and so on, is far more detrimental than COVID-19, or what we're calling COVID-19. But here's another important thing that I want to end with. And this goes back to what I said at the beginning. And this is stated on the Government of Canada's website. The Constitution is Canada's most important law. It's stated to be its supreme law because it can render invalid any laws that are inconsistent with it. So look at the Health Promotion and Protection Act in your province. They are in violation of the Constitution. And that, as one constitutional lawyer says, is another matter to go into. And all regulations or bylaws that are based on the declarations of emergency are in violation because no emergency was proven, was demonstrably justified. There was no justification for limits on your rights and freedoms. All of the data shows that COVID-19 is not an emergency, and the COVID measures are far more harmful than beneficial. But the ultimate question you should ask yourself is, in the event of an emergency, is it ever justified to violate the rights and freedoms of human beings in a free, just, and peaceful society? And who gets to choose that? Who gets to decide? That is something that everybody should ask themselves. So for the last section here, I'm just going to show you, let's see if I can get this up here. Okay, we'll use this. So let me go, okay. If you go to my website, goodfoodunearthed.com, and then in the menu bar here, you can go to the COVID-19 Investigating the Truth webinar series. And we'll just wait for that to load up. And towards the end tail of that webinar series will be information regarding your rights and how to protect them. So let's see, we've got okay. Just wait for that to load for a minute. There's a bigger webinar that's around 3 hours long that I did that talks about know your rights and tools to protect them. And you can always go and have a look at that for some more information. There's also information here on medical ethics in relation to consent, an interview with Leah Wilson from Stand for Health Freedom on informed consent. And this is from Medical Freedom International, which is a great video talking about the information that physicians and medical professionals, health professionals should be abiding by and questions they should be asking that are not conspiracy theory. This is what you should do as a healthcare practitioner if you want to really care for your patients. An interview with James Corbett on medical martial law. Now, here's what I specifically want to talk about. There's John Carpe from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms in Calgary, Alberta. And in this talk he gave on November 29th of 2020, he outlines the how the COVID measures, the declaration of emergency was never demonstrably justified, how the COVID measures, the infringements, the stipulations were never met to allow for infringements, and what is being infringed upon. And here is another constitutional lawyer. This is Rocco Galati from Constitutional Rights Center in Canada. And he also talks about how you have a right to decline any mandatory COVID measures because they are all in violation. Again, there was no proven demonstrably justified emergency, and all infringements on your rights stemming from that are therefore illegal, as well as the fact that these measures such as social distancing and masking and these mandates, these are medical experiments on you without your full informed consent. And that is another violation of your rights. And this here is specifically addressing how the Trespass Act does not apply when exercising masking exemption. So you should have a look at that and inform yourself about what you can do. And the important thing is just to know your rights, know that you have all of the evidence to support you, and it's easy to find. You can look on my website for some resources to link to, and again, that's just a starting point. I am not the end-all be-all resource. I'm just an aid for getting started. That's it. Just one little point, and I'm sure you'll be able to find out way more than I could share with you here. So next time will be part 3, and we're going to look at the international covenants that Canada is signatory to and how the COVID-19 measures are in violation of articles in there.